Hey, welcome back. This is going to be the first of a few sets of slides on David Hume. You'll probably enjoy Hume a lot. I certainly do. The main thing with Hume, basically, then, is to say that everybody else was mistaken in thinking that skepticism was a serious problem. Now, you remember with Descartes and Berkeley, that was pretty clear. They both certainly emphasized that, Berkeley especially, but they were both very concerned and focused their energy on doing that. Now, they did it in very different ways. Of course, Berkeley thought that Descartes was simply mistaken to cling to the assumption that there's actually an external world of material objects. But still, they were both focused on skepticism. For his part, D'Holbach basically agreed with that. I mean, he didn't disagree with that. He didn't put a lot of attention on it. He just went about what he was doing as a response, as a way to defeat skepticism and show that, in fact, knowledge is indeed possible. We noted in talking about him, hopefully you'll recall, that it is a bit of a problem there when you do take that kind of empirical approach, especially when you want to be a materialist at the same time. There's a bit of a misfit there. Berkeley does have a very good point in this regard. D'Holbach doesn't really try to pay a lot of attention to that, but it certainly is true that he was opposed to skepticism. They all were. They all went about it very, very differently, but they have in common that they were opposed to skepticism, thinking basically that we could come up with fundamental knowledge of reality. That's what Hume is actually going to call into question here. So the first part of the book we have, The Inquiry, it's a fairly well-written book. You may enjoy his style more than some of the others. Basically, he's just very critical about where things are at in terms of philosophy. Now, to an extent, everyone else might agree with what he says here, at least on a formal level, that the problem with it is that it wasn't adopting a scientific approach, right? Remember, in the 18th century, science is in the ascendant. Science is really making a lot of rapid progress, and it's looking very impressive as a source of knowledge. Philosophy tended to appear more as if it was just kind of spinning its wheels and looking backwards and really looking quite silly. So he says, Hume, and others basically would agree, you need to take a scientific approach. Certainly that's going to mean in part taking an empirical approach, right? But it's going to mean just a little bit more than that too. But basically he thinks that the reason why people like D'Holbach and Berkeley, Descartes I suppose you could add into the mix, can actually come to such completely opposed conclusions is because they are making that fundamental mistake, and that is they are not making any kind of concession to skepticism. Basically, Hume wants to say that it's a scientific thing to do, a very crucial scientific point to precisely do that, to recognize that there are certain limitations to the degree and quality of knowledge that we can have of reality. He's basically thinking everyone else was more or less naively assuming that if we can pose questions about the fundamental nature of reality, then surely we can come up with answers. But that's exactly what, as you see here, the ultimate sources and principles of reality, Hume wants to throw cold water onto that and basically do that in a scientific way. So the point is basically this. He thinks before you address these bigger questions about reality itself, you first need to think about the tools with which you're working. Any scientific approach should do that. If you go into a scientific laboratory, scientists should understand how their machines or devices and so on work. They need to know what they're capable of doing. They need to know when they're working correctly and when they're not. So with philosophy, basically, that means turning our attention to our own mind first, right? Our own understanding. And that's why Hume's book is called An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. That's where we need to start, right? To try to ascertain just what kinds of questions can we answer, right? And he's going to say, actually, not necessarily the most fundamental ones. Even though we can formulate them, we might be super curious about them, but nonetheless, as he says here, blah, 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 an exact analysis of the powers of human understanding will show that it is utterly unfitted for such remote and abstruse subjects. We can still do philosophy. We can still talk about metaphysics, but there has to be this very kind of sober recognition of the limitations What are the limitations? What is the possible scope of the answers we can come up with? Basically, Hume thinks so much philosophical disagreement stems from people being oblivious to these limits, thinking that they can answer whatever questions come to their mind. They necessarily go too far, so to speak. They're not on the solid basis of empirical evidence, and that's exactly where you get kind of disagreements that might seem unsolvable. So basically, that's the general approach he's going to take. That was the first section. The second and third, that's all we're going to do in this set of slides, are just some basic terms. They're very important, but there's not a whole lot going on here. Keep in mind he's going to use the word perception to refer to any kind of idea or thought, kind of the way today we might say idea. Descartes kind of spoke that way too, but a perception is anything that you're aware of. And these can be in two kinds, basically. He's going to say on the one hand what he calls an impression. That's something that's immediate. That's something that you're experiencing now, so to speak. It could come from outside. It could be something you see. It could be a feeling that comes from inside. The key thing about an impression is that it's immediate and direct. It's happening in the present moment. Ideas, then, are everything else, right? Things that are not happening in the present moment, basically. So there's some kind of remove. So he's safe here. Everything is covered. He defines one thing very precisely. Those are impressions. Those are happening now. Everything else, every other perception, he'll term an idea. Now, impressions are very important. Here's a little scheme. Actually, I'm going to come back to this at a later point, so I'm not going to worry about this just right yet. But basically, the idea about impressions, of course, are super important for any empirical approach, basically. That's really the raw material. That's the real evidence of reality that we get through our senses. And on the connection between impressions and ideas, he says a couple of things. The key thing is the first. He basically says all our ideas come from impressions, right? Sometimes people call this a sort of tabula rasa view. You're born, your mind is empty. It gets filled up solely through experience, and that's just going to mean through impressions. And the main difference is just that, like making copies on a photocopier repeatedly, things fade over time. Just think about memories. That's kind of a paradigm case. Things just fade. He basically just wants to say we don't really add anything else. We can combine them in different ways. We can make stuff up, of course, but it all points back to impressions that we originally have, right? And he basically gives some reasons for this, which amount to saying, well, they have to come from somewhere. He's convinced, as many other people were, that we're not born with ideas, and he's pretty confident that we can that we give an account of any idea in this way. Right? He can't be absolutely sure about this. It's in the nature of his overall empirical approach here that he can't exactly prove this beyond, any conceivable doubt, but he thinks it's extremely reasonable. He's thought long and hard. He asks us likewise, if you can think of an idea that you can't kind of trace back to some original impressions, let him know, shoot him an email. He's dead, but anyway, he thinks, it's pretty safe to say that. So that works well enough for him, more or less. The most important thing that comes out of this, then, is a certain kind of test. Generally, if you think that somebody has an idea or is talking about something that isn't real, as if it were real, though, they're making something up and you want to show them that that's the case, you challenge them to come up with the impression from which it originates. It has to come from some impression. It's not as if it doesn't come from any, but you want to show that it comes from it in the right sort of way. So this is the kind of thing that implicitly Berkeley was already doing with the idea of matter, showing that there's actually no impression of matter as such. And this could work for other things, and we'll see how Hume puts this to use a little bit later, but that's very, very important. But crucial, keep in mind, he says all ideas do come from impressions. That's not the point here. The point is, do they come from impressions in the right sort of way? You have an idea of a unicorn. You could say, does it come from an impression of a unicorn? No, probably not. It comes from how we put together impressions of horses and narwhals or something. I'm not exactly sure. But we can make things up. We just want to know, is there an original impression that corresponds to some given idea? The third section then is not super important. He's just talking about how ideas are related, how they are associated. This predates a lot of more modern psychology, of course. He knows that our minds don't think in random ways. There are certain patterns. He distills out a few here, how things may ideas relate to one another by resemblance. If you see somebody that looks like your friend, then your thoughts turn to your friend. Contiguity, if you see your neighbor, your thoughts might turn to your other neighbor, not because they look alike, but because they are contiguous in that way. Most important here is cause and effect. That's all that's really important here, that sometimes the association of our ideas depends on some ideas of cause and effect. You see smoke, you think fire, for example. That's going to be really important. For now, he's just noting that this is how our ideas get associated. There may be other ways. Nothing is crucial for Hume about there being these three. He really just wants to get cause and effect on the table because that's going to be really important in what lies ahead. So this is just a summary of those points, I think. Basically, it's the next part where we get into section 4, far and away the most important section. It will begin with a further distinction that he draws, and then he's going to get into a discussion of just what exactly is going on when we think in terms of cause and effect. So be sure to read section 4 quite carefully.